thanks, Jeff, for joining me on the podcast. I'm excited to have you here. We're going to talk about a ton of cool stuff getting into the mobile home park space. But first, let's just get a background on you and kind of how you got started into real estate.
My real estate journey kind of started when I was active duty in the Navy. At the time, I joined thinking I was going to be in 20 years, and about 2 months in, I realized that was not going to be the case. So I started looking at what I would do afterwards. Um, and what was really important to me at the time was just having control of my own time. You know, in the military, people tell you where to go, how to dress. They tell you everything you got to do. I just wanted to be in charge of my own life again. So I looked for all sorts of different things I could do to kind of start growing some sort of investments or something as a side hustle while I was in. And real estate really caught my eye because of its passive nature. So I started doing a deep dive and reading every bigger pockets book I could get and listening to podcasts and just casted a really, really wide net to see all the different types of real estate out there and which one made the most sense to me.
Got it. So when you were doing that research, what kind of stood out to you as like the first thing you wanted to jump into in real estate?
Um, Single family houses, honestly, it just seemed like
Hmm.
the first logical step, right? It's so easy. I could have done and I did do zero down deals with the VA loan. You know, when you're getting started, you usually don't have much capital, so that's an easy way to get going. So that's the first thing that made a whole lot of sense to me. And at the time, my goal was to just get something and, you know, try to maybe get something I could rent out some of the rooms, or maybe if I found a duplex, I'd rent out one of the sides and cover my mortgage. So that was my initial goal.
hmm Yeah. So you started out house hacking and you did two properties house hacking, right?
Correct. Correct.
hmm Before you jumped into the larger mobile home space. What can you say about the benefit of doing house hacking and how crucial it was to get you from just starting and getting that first step into real estate to where you are now to kind of bridge the two? Because everyone's always like, I want to do big mobile home parks, commercial, but you got to like do the baby steps to get there almost.
Right. From a confidence perspective, it was huge. You know, to be honest with you, once you have the knowledge to do commercial, I can kind of look back and see how the single families didn't really make a smooth transition to that. But at the time, just having the confidence that I was a real estate investor was able to really give me a big boost. On top of that, it's a really good way to lower your cost of living, right? If you can house hack and eliminate your mortgage, that's most people's biggest expense in life. So if you can get rid of that, you have a lot of extra money left to take some risks and make some investments with.
Mhm. Let's bounce back to right when you were kind of getting out of the military, you transitioned to being a commercial broker. And what were your experiences like with that to kind of getting you educated on mobile home spaces?
Well, I actually was uh, I started getting involved as a broker while I was still in my
Okay.
last about year left, and that was intentional because I knew uh, anywhere in the real estate, and you probably know this as a realtor, you don't make any money. You don't get any pay. You don't get paid by anybody.
Yeah.
So it takes a very long time to get your book of business going. So my brother-in-law actually was working at a commercial brokerage, and he was explaining his day was pretty simple. He called park owners and he called park investors, and he just tried to connect the two. And I figured either it was exactly as simple as he was saying, or I was just curious. So I wanted to learn more. So I shadowed him for a week or two, and then I decided I immediately wanted to jump into doing it myself. So I got my real estate license, and as soon as I got licensed, I just started cold calling and trying to find deals.
hmm Was cold calling your best strategy that you use to find deals? Would you ever
Yes,
like it? Could you door knock a mobile home park?
you could, but you'd put a million miles on your car, right? I mean,
Yeah.
with your area is so advanced, like so great. Like I was working on deals all across the southeast of the U.S., but I was still living in Colorado. So cold calling was pretty much the only way we got done any deals done, really.
hmm So you would just basically skip trace all the owners, call all of them, and I can't imagine there's a ton of mobile home park owners in like one state. Were you looking in multiple states?
We were looking in multiple states at the time, and just trying to figure out. It was very interesting how different each state was. just based
Hmm.
on the perception. And I would call parks in California, and people would basically tell me to go to hell, and never call them again. And I'd call parks in Georgia or Tennessee, and people would talk to me about anything. And
Hmm.
so I found people a lot more friendly in the southeastern states. So I started to focus on that, and that's where I did most of the deals as a broker.
Oh, okay. Um, so as a broker, were you licensed in multiple states then in order to do, since you were talking to so many different people?
The brokerage I was at was licensed in multiple states.
Okay.
So yeah, so
Hmm.
they use, and if it was a state they weren't, they would use. There's basically lawyers out there who have their license in all 50 states, or at least like 40 something of them, and you
Hmm.
basically work under them to do a deal in another state.
Hmm. Got it. Okay. So what state did you end up focusing on for your personal properties of mobile home parks that you've purchased?
Alabama, that was my
Okay.
bread and butter.
Hmm.
Right.
Got it. What stood out about that state compared to some of the other ones, in addition to what you said about they were more, willing to answer questions and just chat about their properties?
Well, there wasn't much different between it and other states in the Southeast. I just think personally, I had lived there for a good bit of time and I knew a lot about the state. And I just found that when I was talking to property owners, I could, even if I wasn't familiar with their specific town, I knew a lot about Alabama. So I knew what kind of things they're into, what kind of things are important in that state, mostly football. Um, and I could have easier conversations there. So that's kind of why I gravitated towards it.
Hmm. What's the main difference when analyzing a mobile home park compared to what someone would be doing on a single family home or a duplex?
Well, I mean, not just mobile home parks, but commercial in general. You're going to make all your value by getting better numbers from your property, right? And I think what drew me to commercial, I'm definitely a numbers guy. You could take me to 10 houses and ask me what it's worth, and I really wouldn't have any clue, right? I don't know what backsplash does to a property's value. It doesn't make any sense to me. But with commercial, if you can improve the net operating income, you directly improve the value of the property. And so you can look for inefficiencies in how they're running it now, where you can come in. You don't necessarily have to flip a property, like putting in hundreds of thousands to improving the physical condition of the property. You can just operate it in a better way and make it worth more, right? So that to me is where I saw a lot of opportunity. And the caveat to that is you have to look at a lot of properties to know what's normal. It's very hard to look at one commercial deal and know that their expenses are probably not what they're saying they are, or that sort of thing. So it takes you have to look at a lot of properties, but you can then start kind of seeing trends and figuring out where you can make improvements to places.
Hmm. What are some of the biggest improvements that you've made on your properties to become a better operator of them?
Well, it usually comes down to filling up empty lots and charging the market rate, right? So with mobile
Hmm.
home parks, the typical backstory on most of the deals I've bought, the owner owned the land, and then just one person asked them if they could move their trailer in, and they said yes. And over time, that just happened more and more and more. Next thing you know, 40 years went by and 30 to 50 people live there. And
Hmm.
so those kind of owners, they never sat out to develop it. They didn't really have a business plan. So a lot of times they have no clue what they should even be charging, what services they should include and not. So you'll see things where park owners will include the water, the power, grass mowing. They'll include all of that in the expenses when they really don't need to, because it's not industry standard to do so. So something like that is a simple thing you can do, and just as soon as you get that, you make the tenants responsible for it, and in turn, that makes the property worth more because there's more profit.
Hmm. What should someone aim for in terms of occupancy, and expense ratio, and overall rent prices for mobile homes in, let's say, in Alabama, we'll say?
Well, I'm a big believer that you really need to be around 350 per month to rent a lot and be able to profit. A lot of times, what will happen is owners will not have a true idea of what their actual expenses are. For example, they may have roads, septic tanks, power lines, water lines. All of those things are depreciating every single day, and eventually they need to be completely replaced. But that doesn't show up monthly. You don't pay for those things monthly. So a lot of owners, if they're not really, really sharp business people, won't realize that. And so they think they have almost no expenses, right? So that's why I think the 350 number, when you look at what it costs to completely replace a septic tank or completely replace power lines, you need to be charging about that much to be able to set aside enough money over time to replace those things. So that's kind of the number I see as a good lot rent. But in terms of occupancy, affordable housing is in such a crisis right now in America. You should be at 100% at any affordable, mobile home park that you have.
Hmm. So are most of your parks, you're basically renting out the space and then they bring their own trailer and park it on top of it, or do you have somewhere they can rent out with the trailer as well?
I have both. I in the beginning I was naive and I thought I wanted to own both things to get more, income from it. And it just hasn't worked out that way. Those mobile homes are considered personal property because they can be moved. So you can rent it for $10,000 a home if you wanted to, but that doesn't make the property worth any more because it's personal property. And it tends to be that when you do rent out those homes, they get destroyed. The maintenance on them is not, it's so high and so expensive that you can't turn a profit on it. So
Hmm.
I have found that the most successful way to run a park is to just rent the lots. Don't own any of the houses.
Hmm. So when you're just renting out the lots, seems like your biggest expenses would just be the water, sewer lines, and electrical, um, and then maintaining the grounds. Was there anything else that's kind of stands out really big in those expenses?
There's a lot, and it tends to be that there's a lot of things that aren't obvious that really
Hmm.
jump up. So property tax is a big one. Property
Hmm.
insurance, right? Having general liability insurance. It's not a huge thing, but it tends to be once you start adding up all these small things, it really adds up to about 30 to 35% of what you bring in. So
Okay.
it's really important to have a really good understanding of what it's going to actually cost to operate it.
Hmm. When you have done the financing for all these properties, what routes have you gone, and how is it different than doing financing for a single family home?
It's commercial in general and park specifically, probably more so park specifically. It's a case by case basis when you get your loans, right? If you go and get a loan on a house, that may be the 10th loan that bank or that mortgage broker has done for a house that week or that month, right? It's a very streamlined process, and they basically just look at you and say yes, they can afford it. The house is appraised. They check their boxes, and it's on to the next thing. And it can get done in about 2 weeks to 30 days, maybe. With commercial properties and parks, it's a lot different, right? You're usually having to go to local banks because there's not a nationwide lender on parks. I mean, there is, but not on the parks I buy. I buy smaller ones, and they're of a size that those large national groups don't want to work on it. And so every time I've had to do a deal, I've had to go to different banks and multiple banks each time to talk to as many of them as I can to whittle it down to the people who would do it and do it for the best price. So there's a lot more work involved in the financing side of it, which makes seller financing attractive. But at the end of the day, it's easy to find deals, I think, because of that, because people don't want to deal with that headache. But I'd rather find a deal and just have to work to get it financed than have to work to find a deal.
Hmm. Are there just not a lot of banks out there that will do mobile home park financing, or what's the main reason that's tricky to find?
They just don't see a lot of them, right? And banks, when you get a loan on a house, it's really only going to be on the bank's books for maybe a week or two before they sell it to some big group on Wall Street. So they genuinely really don't care. Um,
Hmm.
when you go to these smaller town banks, they're going to hold the note for the whole time. So they want to make sure that it's going to go well. So they're going to go visit it. They're going to ask you a million questions. And you have to usually educate them on why you want to buy a park in the first place. I mean, the first time I ever went to a bank, the first question the guy asked me, and he actually lived, the park I was buying was on his commute to work. And he says, "Why do you want to buy a trailer park?" No. So I had to explain to him from the ground up, hey, this is why. So um, it's much more involved in that process.
Hmm. What type of value add can typically be done to a mobile home park?
I mean, if you find a good one, you could definitely double the value of a property that you buy, and in not much time either. I think really what I have found is the easiest type of deal is just a simple rent raise, right? Where you can look at the market and you see several properties that are charging X. The property you're looking at is charging Y, and there's no justification as to why it's lower. So you can just say, okay, over 3 years, I'm going to steadily increase this and get it to that market rate. And that property can be worth double if the rent they're charging at the time is half, right? So that's probably the easiest one. Outside of that, you can expand parks, right? It's fairly easy to do. It's not like an apartment where there's 50 units and there will always be 50 units. If you've got extra land, you can put more tanks in or expand your sewer lines and add more lots and grow it that way. So I really like that part. You can look at a deal and get creative and figure out the best way to improve its value.
Hmm. For the tenants that you have, what challenges often come up since they're only renting the lots and ideally just the lots and not the actual trailer itself? And what challenges do they typically bring to you?
Well, I think it's usually just a problem of how many tenants you have. I don't think it's anything particular with park tenants versus maybe apartment tenants. I think if you take any group of the US population, there's going to be 5 to 10% who are going to be difficult. And, that's what happens. There's a benefit to having a lot of units on a small dollar amount property, and that your chances of the vacancy being high is pretty low because a lot of people would have to move out to make that happen versus a duplex. If one person moves out, you're at 50%. Um, but that's probably one of the biggest problems, just how many people you have to deal with for the value of the property itself. It can be challenging. Um, One of the things I have learned when I first got into this, I thought it was going to be very, very difficult to track everybody down and collect rent. But reality is it's so affordable, and it's really the best option for people. There's not necessarily a cheaper option out there, and so people will pay the rents. Sometimes they'll get a couple months behind, but from my experience, they usually catch up if they own their own house.
Hmm. Do many people like, or do does Section 8 allow on mobile home parks, or how does that work with Section 8?
So if you own a house and you rent out the house, depending on the county that you're in or the city, they will allow them to use Section 8 to rent a house. I have found it to be very, very difficult just because those mobile homes are not built to the standard of a brand new house. And a lot of times you're just naturally not up to the standard that Section 8 sets. And so yeah, I have a property where I'm working on trying to possibly sell the house now. I've had 16 maintenance requests from the tenant in the last 6 months, and it's a Section 8 tenant. And I mean, I've spent more than they would have paid me in rent. And it's just, but I have to. Every time a maintenance request comes up, I have to go out there and fix it. And so it's just really, really tough to make the numbers work.
Hmm. What type of demand is there for mobile home parks? Because when I see them and when other people I talk to, they're like, I wouldn't really want to live in a mobile home park. So why would other people be wanting to live in a mobile home park?
Well, it's number one, it's affordable, right? Where I, the kind of the general sense of the industry is that you want to find an area where the houses are really expensive, and so that the cost of the park is so much cheaper that people just elect to live there for the cost. Where I live in, or where I lived in Alabama, where the properties I own are, the land and the houses are not that expensive, and so a mobile home is really in a mobile home in a park is not that much more affordable than just owning your own house. It just tends to be that it's a small town and there are not really any new developers in there building houses. So a mobile home might be the best way to get a house, whether you're going to live in a park or not, right? Even if you want to buy land, going to Clayton and getting a brand new mobile home is probably your best bet, your cheapest bet. And some of
Hmm.
those houses are extremely nice. I mean, I have several tenants who have houses that are bigger square footage than what I live in right now, right? So um, it's different for everybody, but where I'm at, it's usually it's a blend of affordable but still high quality. It's not a um, apartment complex where your neighbor, you hear everything your neighbor does.
Yeah. So are you managing these yourself, or do you have anyone that you hire to help manage all of this?
I used to have somebody who helped me manage it, but just this year I started taking over the management myself. Um, and that's a challenging process, but I find that property management is probably the most crucial part of a deal because you can make whatever numbers you want up on a spreadsheet, but you actually have to go out there and execute and be very, very accurate. Otherwise, it's not going to be worth it, right? If you have a 20 unit property and you consistently have two of them empty, that's that could be most of your profit, right? Because you're going into it with a loan for 70 to 75%. So you have to be very, very um, diligent when you're operating a property. So for me, the process really basically boils down to collections, making sure we follow up with people when they're behind and just figuring out when they're going to get back to us on payment and staying on top of that so they don't get too far behind, and then responding to maintenance requests when they come up.
Hmm. What are the typical maintenance requests that you'll get?
It's usually a septic issue, right? Maybe the septic that they're saying their toilets aren't really flushing, which is not a plumbing problem. Sometimes the tank needs to be pumped.
Mm.
Um, Rarely they'll have an electrical issue on the park side where we have to go and fix the electrical box. That rarely happens. And outside of that, maybe there's a busted water line on the park's end. On the park side, I manage. We are responsible from the water meter back, and the tenants are
Hmm.
responsible from the water meter to their house.
Yeah.
That's where most of the issues are going to come up. So it's really not a ton of maintenance requests at all
Hmm.
usually.
Yeah. Hmm. Where do you see the future of mobile home parks going?
Yeah, I see them becoming popular again. I think they were really popular back in the 70s and 80s. And then nowadays they have a pretty horrible stigma, right? Of just being, trailer parks and being a horrible place to live. And I think what's happening is that there's a wave of young investors who are getting into, and not just young, but new investors who are getting into the space and actually operating them professionally to where they're not falling apart and the tenants are being held to a higher standard and they're actually becoming safe and nice places to live again. I think we're going to see more and more new parks being built from the ground up, and it's going to be what some people do as their starter home rather than buy a $600,000 house as their starter home. They'll buy $150,000 double wide and they'll save for a few years and then buy their own place.
Mhm.
Where I lived in Auburn, there was parks that were entirely college students. Like you had to be a college student to live there, which is completely unique in the country. There's not a lot of places
Yeah.
that happens, but when you talk to them, it makes sense. They have a pool, they have volleyball courts. Everybody around them is a college student that owns their own house. Basically, it's a pretty cool place. So I think there's going to be more of that as the stigma goes away.
Hmm. How many mobile home parks are being built nowadays? Like, 'cause I don't think I ever see any like new ones that are being built. It's just like maybe one gets remodeled, but
I would
yeah.
think there's probably less than 100 being built across the country, and
Wow.
and I
That's
would and that's a really good benefit to owning a park is that you don't have a real risk of somebody building one right next door to you and taking your customers like you do with
hmm
storage or apartments or anything like that.
yeah.
Um, that really it's partly because of the cost, but it's mostly because of zoning, right? Cities just do not want to let that happen. The tenants at parks typically take more money out of the tax system than they contribute, and so
hmm
cities fight it tooth and nail. Even when you do have a park, they still fight you tooth and nail to try to get rid of it. So
mm
building new ones. I mean, there's some going on in Texas and near where I was in Alabama. There's one I knew of that was being built, but it was in the county. And in where I lived in Alabama, in the counties, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So I think we'll see more of that. I think we'll see small parks populate on the outskirts of cities, um, right in like the county line city kind of zone. But I don't think we'll see any be, be built inside of a city limits ever again, really.
hmm what's some of the biggest lessons you've learned since you've been growing your mobile home park portfolio?
Um, Scale is not scale doesn't save you, right? You can get a lot of properties and still not have a system and still not know what you're doing. Um, and I bought my first park with my partner, and then within 8 months we had bought five, and we never stopped and sat down and tried to reflect on what we were doing wrong and what we were doing right. So, and there's a couple of deals we regret buying because once we kind of honed in our strategy, we said, hey, these ones don't serve our goals. So I would say go slow, take it a deal at a time, make sure your property's doing what you thought it would do, and then go get your next one, right? Because even if you hit a slam dunk property, real estate is so slow and it takes so long to make money. You're not going to see, you could put in an immense amount of effort. It's not going to change the next months of your life. So just take the time to reflect before you go on to that next deal.
Mm-hmm. What would you say that timeline is for needing to wait and make sure that you're getting the profits that you want and everything panned out before going to your next one?
Maybe a quarter. I don't think you need to
Okay.
wait much longer than that. Like if you're going to buy any sort of property, your headaches are going to come up pretty much immediately, right? The tenants who have been talking to the landlord for years about that tree limb over their house, they're going
Yep.
to, the second there's a new owner, that's the only thing you're going to hear about. So you get all of those kind of surprises right in the beginning. It's mostly just about how much focus you can put into something. So if you've got partners and one of you wants to take a lead on it, the other one can go and get the next one, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you're doing it by yourself or you're both working on it simultaneously, I would say if you're collecting 100% of what you need to, your property's full, then you can probably look and say, okay, let's go on to the next one.
Mm-hmm. So you've grown to how many? 4 mobile home parks so far?
Seven,
Seven.
across
Seven.
Alabama. Most of those are with partners. I just closed on one last month. That was the first one I did as a syndication. So I had
Mm-hmm.
investors and it was just me. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so between those is seven.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So started house hacking to 7 mobile home parks. What's some like good motivational advice that you would have for anyone that's looking to get started in real estate or mobile home parks?
I'd say set your expectations, right? Our portfolio is still not making a ton of money, right? Because it's slow. In real estate, you can only make, you can't really make more than you expected. It's not like a business where you can go and get more customers. The only thing you could do is make less. So go slow and don't expect a lot of profit quickly. The other thing I would say is just you're going to have to find your first opportunities. There's a ton of barriers to entry in real estate, especially commercial. There's a ton of chicken and the egg scenarios where you want to get your first deal, but brokers don't want to talk to you because you don't have anything. Then you get your first deal, and then you go to a bank and they don't want to give you a loan because you've never done this before. So there's a ton of situations like that where you really just need to, keep moving forward and just not take no for an answer. Listen to when people tell you no and figure out why, and take it with a grain of salt, but just keep pursuing, and you will get there if you just keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Awesome. Great advice, Jeff. Thanks so much for giving us a good education on mobile home parks. If anyone has any questions and wants to contact you, where can they find you at?
Probably just my phone. Just give me a text or a call at 540-333-4014. Love the chat.
Awesome. Thanks again, Jeff.